What's up, everybody? This is your boy Uber Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga, here to bring you another video with no frills, just the analysis. And today I'm here to bring you the review of Hunter x Hunter episode 123 entitled Centipede and Memory. Alright, first of all, I thought this was a really weird name for this episode, Centipede and Memory. When I first saw the title of the episode come up on the screen. And after watching it, obviously, I know what it refers to now. And I just have to say that those black centipedes were gross as fuck. That was so disgusting. Seeing those centipedes wrap around Ikalgo's brain like that just really freaking grossed me out. But other than that, another great episode of Hunter x Hunter. Just absolutely fantastic writing by Togashi Yoshihiro. So let me just say a few preliminary things and then I'll get into the summary and analysis of this week's episode. Alright, so first, the naming issue. The name issue with Netero and Meruemu. A lot of you in last week's episode review talked about how I didn't mention or bring up the reason why Meruemu eventually decided to fight Netero, which is so that he could learn his name. And the reason why I didn't bring that up is because the naming issue is really like frosting on the cake. It's not quite filler, but it's relatively insubstantial when you look at the entire scheme of things. Why do I say that? I say that because it doesn't add anything, really. It doesn't add anything to the story that we couldn't already work out from other aspects of what we know so far. Of course, it's rather obvious that Meruemu's desire for a name or to learn his name or to be named is symbolic of his larger goal or larger desire for self-consciousness. That's obvious. But what's not obvious to me is why that particular symbolism needed to be stated. It's obvious to the point of almost being trivial. It just wasn't a reason for me to bring it up. Not only that, if you go back and look at the time for last week's episode review, it was like 30 minutes. So when I looked at the time, I was already a half an hour. And even when I initially looked at my notes, I realized that I already had a lot of notes and that I probably wouldn't get to it, but it wasn't that important anyway for the reasons I just stated. Also, this episode was a rather pleasant surprise because, honestly, at first, I didn't really give a shit about the fight between Ikalgo and Welfin. I was thinking to myself, why go from this fantastic fight and really ideological conflict between Netero and Meruemu to Welfin and Ikalgo? That's like That's like trading in your Rolls. That's like trading in your Rolls Royce for a Volvo. It just, it just wasn't adding up to me. So initially, I was rather skeptical of going away from the Netero versus Meruemu fight to the Welfin versus Ikalgo fight, especially considering the fact that we have been waiting for this fight between Netero and Meruemu for like, I don't even know, like 2 months or something like that. 7 weeks, 8 weeks, something like that. But Togashi Yoshihiro is is so good that even when you're skeptical about leaving the Netero versus Meruemu fight to see Welfin versus Ikalgo, he's so good that even if you're skeptical about that transition, you still feel great about having watched that whole exchange. And Togashi is really working the shit out of the characterization of the Chimera ants. I mean, this is just really absolutely fantastic writing. So now on to the summary and analysis of this week's episode. Basically, only one thing happens in this episode, which is Ikalgo versus Welfin, and Welfin's subsequent character transformation, if you will. And before I get really into that, let me just say this. Togashi should be praised not only for the depth and the breadth of his writing, which just in the Chimera Ant arc alone is rather impressive and extensive. But he should also be praised for the scope of his writing. It's just ridiculous. I mean, he is just going crazy with this motif of psychological and ethical transformation. And it's this motif is just being worked from freaking Gone to Yuppie to Meruemu to Netero to Knuckle. I mean, he is just working the shit out of this motif from several different angles, and it's just incredibly impressive. And of course, the Welfin versus Ikalgo fight in this episode was just really another variation or another perspective or another point of view, just another way of working this theme. So now let's get into Welfin versus Ikalgo. Initially, I had somewhat of a problem with the setup for this fight. Just flat out, Ikalgo's a damn idiot for what he did in this episode. You know what I mean? There's just no way to dispute his idiocy, his fuckery, if you will, in this episode. So he's sitting there crying like a dumbass and just absolutely not paying attention to the video monitors or even his surroundings. And I'm just sitting up there saying to myself, how is it that Welfin just sneaks up on him like that? I mean, Ikalgo was crying to the point where he didn't even realize another person had walked into the room. That's like freaking ridiculous. And obviously, his crying, sitting up there crying like a little punk, isn't gonna do anything but hurt his mission or hurt his accomplishment of his mission objectives, obviously. But then I realized that this whole scenario was just a plot device that was leading up to Welfin's characterization. And even though Welfin's character transformation wasn't necessarily foreshadowed, he's a minor character, so I figured, whatever. I mean, the plot device wasn't that bad, really. And it just served. I mean, it basically did what a plot device is supposed to do. Set up something without bringing an unnecessary amount of attention to itself. Point blank. That's basically what it's there to do. And once you realize what the plot device, how a plot device is supposed to function, you can just let it go, just like I did. So now let's talk about Welfin and his characterization. And let me lead into that by, again, talking about Togashi and how he's really working these character transformations, these psychological and ethical transformation of the characters. Togashi is really a genius for developing Nin, the system of Nin. This power system in Hunter x Hunter, this nin system, is one of the most unique and complex power systems I've ever seen, especially in the shonen manga, and probably within manga more generally, or even anime. I'm not just going to limit this to manga. Even in anime, it's one of the most unique and complex power systems I've ever seen. And the reason for that is because the character's power, because in the nin system, each character has their own unique ability that's specifically designed to manifest their own character traits, their own unique individuality. And this nin system is so great because the character's powers are so intimately and integrally related to their characterization. These nin abilities really serve as a sort of external augmentation and expression of the character's internal characterization. It's just absolutely breathtaking to see how precisely Togashi is weaving this nin system into the fiber of these characters, and then using that characterization to weave the narrative in the Chimera Ant arc. It's just really a joy to read and a joy to watch. And this is, as far as I can tell, I mean, at least just from my own perspective, because I don't want to overgeneralize, but from what I've read and what I've watched, and I've watched and read a lot of different anime, and a lot of anime and manga in general, even spanning decades of time, this is a rather unique literary technique that I haven't seen used quite as effectively as the way Togashi is using this technique in Hunter x Hunter, where the characters' abilities themselves are a part of their characterization. Very unique and unusual literary technique for a mangaka. I'm not sure I've seen it to a certain extent, like with um, Ichigo from Bleach, where you have Shirosaki and his inner hollow, and how that's a part of his characterization. But off the top of my head, I can't really think of any other anime or manga where that's really the case, except for, and in this particular case, it's absolutely the best I've ever seen, except for Kenshin Himura's Sakobato. I could, man, just go back and watch. I think it was my second or third video I ever posted on this channel. Go back and watch my review of Rurouni Kenshin, and listen to me talk about that Sakobato. It's absolutely the best I've ever seen. But outside of that, Togashi Yoshihiro's Nin system in Hunter x Hunter is probably the second best I've ever seen. And just like Yuppie, Welfin's Nin ability becomes the instrument and the symbolization for his character transformation, for his psychological and ethical transformation. And at first, while I was watching this, I thought it was just sort of pure irony that Welfin's skepticism, his defining character trait, his defining character feature, is what eventually led to I won't say his destruction, but eventually did him in, if you will. But now I see, in retrospect, in thinking about Yuppie's character transformation and how his transformation was directly related to his nin ability, I see that this was probably Togashi's plan the whole time. For Welfin, just like it was for Yuppie. And I realized that it wasn't irony, but it was just a sort of natural evolution of Welfin's characterization. And in retrospect, it probably should have been a little bit more obvious or a little bit more predictable than it was. Because I never, like I said, I read this manga, geez, like a year ago, so I forgot pretty much a whole ton of shit. So I don't remember anything about Welfin or how he transformed or if he transformed or anything. But in retrospect, I see now that I probably should have been onto this since it had already happened with Yuppie before. And now we see that Welfin's nin ability was just an externalization of his insecurity and character flaws. And his nin ability really revealed the flaws in his character. First of all, Welfin's ability was basically useless against any strong-willed opponent. Just right off the top. And Ikalgo proved this right from Jump Street. Not only that, but Welfin based his nin abilities on the assumption that everyone would be as weak-willed as him. And it's obvious that Welfin did this. I mean, he pretty much said it. And on top of that, it was shown as evidence by the fact that Ikalgo just used straight up willpower to defy Welfin's nin ability. And Welfin even says something to this effect. What he said was, and I have to quote this directly, so I get it all. Welfin said, this is what he was saying to himself when Ikalgo was shooting his ass with that rifle. What he said was, I had a feeling this would happen eventually, but still, I didn't think I was this weak. I didn't think it'd be so scary to face someone who fights with no disregard for their own life. In other words, I didn't realize I was this weak-willed, and I didn't believe somebody could be so strong-willed, just like I said. And on top of that, Welfin assumed, the third thing, was that Welfin assumed that everyone would calculate the risks and benefits of an action in a way that conformed to Welfin's notion of rationality. He just assumed that everyone else would make decisions based on the same calculus that he was using. I mean, he couldn't conceive of the possibility that people would act in a way that he wouldn't act, because he just assumed that his way of acting was absolutely rational, and he based his nin abilities on that assumption. And at one point, Welfin even mentioned that he designed his abilities, generally like all nin users do. He designed his abilities to reflect his own personality. And the flaws of Welfin's thinking were fabulously, fantastically symbolized uh, in his the flaws of the flaws of Welfin's thinking symbolized in his nin ability directly led to his introspection. I mean, that was the great part about this episode, and the great part about Welfin's character transformation. Again, you start off where Welfin has all of these character flaws, and those character flaws get expressed in terms of his nin ability. And then when another character like Ikalgo comes along and challenges his nin ability, it has a ripple effect throughout Welfin's characterization. Just absolutely brilliantly done. And what I really loved was the juxtaposition between Welfin's bondage, because he was really a slave to his own thinking, to his own calculus. He was like inside of his own bubble. So he was, in a sense, viciously bound, viciously enslaved by his own psychology, by his own thinking. And I really love the juxtaposition between Welfin's bondage and his subsequent freedom by having this confrontation with Ikalgo. Again, like I always say, physical conflicts in manga, or really I would say in any medium, are it's almost always the case that they should reveal or should get at some deeper or larger ideological conflict in the narrative. And this was fabulously expressed in this episode. And like I said, Welfin's ninability was based on scheming, manipulation, equivocation, not prevarication, equivocation. There is a difference. Look it up. That's your vocab assignment for this episode review. Look up the difference between prevarication and equivocation. And the fact that his targets must answer him truthfully in order not to be attacked. And think about that and juxtapose it with the fact that it was Welfin telling the truth. Not the person who he was targeting. It was Welfin telling the truth that negated his ninability and led to his subsequent freedom. That's just in a sense, a beautiful irony and a beautiful juxtaposition. As like I said, his ninability was predicated on his targets telling the truth. And yet it was Welfin telling the truth that led to the negation of his ninability and his subsequent freedom. Absolutely great writing. Great writing. And this fits perfectly, again, with the motifs of psychological and ethical transformation that I've been just systematically outlining episode after episode after episode, and that Togashi has been systematically outlining episode after episode after episode. And this particularly relates to Welfin's, how can I put this, his coming into self-consciousness, his evolution into self-consciousness, if you will. And it was only by accessing his human side, the memories that he had before he became a Chimera ant. It was only by accessing his human side that Welfin was able to do this, to finally get some sense of freedom. And again, there's this psychological juxtaposition between the Chimera ants and the humans embodied right in Welfin's character transformation in this episode, right in his psychology in this episode. And remember, again, like I said before, it's not just individual psychology. It's not just subjective individual psychology. It's social psychology because it's dealing with the relationship, the psychological relationship between characters. It's about interpersonal psychology. That's why it's social psychology. And again, it's important to make that distinction between individual subjective psychology on the one hand and social psychology on the other, and the way in which those two things are woven together throughout this narrative, throughout this Chimera Ant arc. Now, let me just address a couple other things before I end this video. I made a very interesting observation, or at least what I think is an interesting observation in this episode. Togashi has developed a very unique, I will say unique, and intriguing way to resolve violence that I haven't quite seen before. Maybe I have. I can't really think of any off the top of my head. He's using characterization to as the substructure to undergird ideological conflicts and resolving those ideological conflicts in a way that leads to the resolution of physical conflicts. You saw this happen with Yuppie, where Yuppie didn't kill Morel, Knuckle, Shoot, and all those guys. And again, you see it here, where Ikalgo doesn't kill Welfin, doesn't continue to attack him. And like I said before, generally in a shonen manga, there's some shitty reason about why characters don't kill other characters when they have an opportunity to. Generally, this is the villain, where the villain acts all arrogant and I don't have to kill you because you're so useless and petty and I'm so powerful. But here, we actually get legitimate, substantial reasons for why there's a postponement or a deferral of violence. And I really like that. And of course, you know my take on this whole thing of how I feel about how ideology should be used in fights. Also, man, Palm. I can't believe it's too late for Palm. Damn. Like I said, I uh I haven't read this series in a year, so I don't remember what happened to Palm. But from the looks of things, like I said, all I can say is damn. Looks like we're too late. And wasn't really expecting that because like I said, I didn't remember what happened. But so this was your boy Uber Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga. Just brought you another video with no frills, just the analysis. Peace and have a blessed day.